Hello and welcome to Atheism for Lent. Thank you if you're joining live, but also thank you if you're not. Doesn't matter to me. If you don't join live, you don't get the very charismatic and interesting pre-conversation. I'm sure everyone will agree that it's worth waiting for. But thank you for surviving to this point. If you are surviving, I don't know. There's a lot of material, and I do feel that by the time we've got to this point, uh, there must be a little bit of fatigue setting in. There's the initial excitement, then there's the, oh my goodness, this stuff's pretty difficult and whatever, and then there might be the point of going, why am I doing this? So congratulations if you have made it this far. This week, we are looking at, for want of a better word, we can call them the theological materialists. Now, in a sense, the thinkers that you'll be looking at this week are responding to or are in the same ballpark, the same playing field as the thinkers that we looked at last week. They are people who take seriously the idea that there is something about faith that is firmly embedded in the world, that is firmly embedded in the dirt of the earth, and that although they're very influenced, someone like Tillich is influenced by the mystics. They are also reading the mystics and reading people like Feuerbach and Marx, and seeing what comes out of that reading. And actually, there is a journey to this Atheism for Lent course, and the journey, in a sense, is what's happening in the history of philosophy and theology. In that a thinker comes along, they respond to the crises of their day. They use the thinkers of their day and the thinkers that precede their day to try to think cogently and think well about how to interpret life and how to engage with life. But then thinkers come after that and they do the same, but they actually by definition have kind of more to work with. Meister Eckhart never was able to read Meister Eckhart because he was Meister Eckhart. He'd never read the secondary literature, which attempted to systematize and draw out kind of like themes within his work. And also, of course, he never was able to engage with the thinkers who came after. So there's a way of reading philosophy that is saying that the great thinkers of any tradition, but the great, the really great thinkers, the ones who have read and reflected deeply, are always responding to and drawing out the great insights of the past and bringing them into the contemporary situation. And it's not that there's this like progress to some endpoint necessarily, but great thinking encapsulates, draws into itself the thinkers of the past. So the thinkers that we're going to look at now are, I think all of them are like mid to late 20th century thinkers who have, most of them who have read, reflected on the great tradition of theology. And so we have, I think this week, Mother Teresa, we have Mary Daly, we have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we have Paul Tillich. Now, my role in every week is to be a type of John the Baptist for the readings. I am here to clear the way. And actually, that is the role of a lecturer generally in the humanities. Their job is to be a John the Baptist to the messianic message of the great thinkers that you're looking at. And so that's what I want to do today. And I particularly want to talk about the central reflection of this week. And it's actually over 3 days because it's a long reflection. It's an essay by Paul Tillich, great theologian of the 20th century, one of my favorite theologians. And this is one of my favorite essays by one of my favorite theologians. I have to be honest, I probably read this essay a long time ago, but it was only when John Caputo, who's a thinker that I really respect, it was only when John Caputo said that he loved this essay, that he thought it was a brilliant reflection, that I kind of went back and reread it and realized how good it was. I suppose it's like, listening to a song. and then a friend of yours who really knows about music says, oh, that song is like, it's brilliant, it's canonical. And then you go back and listen to it and go, oh, wow, yeah, I never appreciated it before. That's how I feel about this essay. It's beautiful. I've now read it probably a dozen times. And I actually read it just 2 hours ago, in preparation for this. And again, it speaks to me in new and interesting ways. So I'm going to talk about that essay to try to make it a little bit easier to access. And also, I think that it's central to understanding this materialist theology that I think is represented by people like Daly and Bonhoeffer and Teresa. Now, as always, we're going to simplify a little bit. I'm going to draw together thinkers that are actually, at times different and distinct and doing interesting, subtle things. But there is something that I think draws this week together. And my job is to try to draw out what that is. I guess it's like a gardener or something. If I go into a garden, I see lots of different plants and flowers, and they all look different, and they all are different. But a gardener can come in and say, well, these flowers are all, connected to this species, this genus, and these ones to this. That's what I'm going to try and do here, is draw out the similarities that these disparate thinkers have. And I'm going to do that by reflecting on this essay, which has got a very boring title, Two Types of Philosophy of Religion. Okay, so what is Paul Tillich doing in this essay, and why is it important? Well, first of all, Paul Tillich starts by saying something quite interesting. He says that the philosophy of religion, one of its goals, one of the reasons why it's important, is to help protect religion and science from reverting back to superstition, to half gods, half mortals, to half super beings, half sub beings, right? And it's interesting because he doesn't just say philosophy of religion is there to help concrete religion not to become superstitious. He says that actually the philosophy of religion has a very important role to play in science as well. And we'll probably come back to what that is in a second. But, that's an interesting opening gambit. And then he says that, basically there's two ways of approaching or understanding God. Now, that's interesting because, again, you read philosophy and you read theology and you find hundreds and thousands of fascinating and subtle approaches. But he says, basically, you can put these into two buckets. And, by and large, I think there's a lot to this. He says the first bucket is to think of God in ontological terms. And the second bucket is to think of God in cosmological terms. And he says this very clearly when he says, God is either that which you're estranged from, or God is a stranger. So you're either estranged from the absolute, or the absolute is a stranger. Now, at first you go, so what's the distinction? Well, a stranger is someone you meet, is someone who is apart from you. They've been outside of your life, and then you encounter them, say, at a bus stop or whatever. But to be estranged from something is to have a broken relationship with someone you already know. So, if you're got an estranged relationship with your father, they're not a stranger, rather something has got in the way of that relationship. And estrangement is connected to the ontological approach, and the stranger is connected to the cosmological approach. Now, Paul Tillich uses some 13th century thinkers to kind of try to clarify this. And he basically puts Augustine on one side and Aquinas on the other. So what does it mean to say that God, to approach God in an ontological way? Well, basically, Tillich says To treat God in this way is to say that God is not some object that you argue for or argue against. God is the name we give to that which animates the argument itself. So if you have two people arguing about whether God exists or not, and they're standing on stage and they're arguing back and forth, there's something that they both hold in common, which is the desire to know the answer. They both have a common animating desire, at least, maybe they're there for money or something like that. But the idea is that they're both trying to argue for the truth. And for Augustine, God is not the result of the argument. God is the name we give to that which animates the argument, to the truth, not as some thing that you can grasp at the end of a rational discussion, but the truth, in a sense, is that which motivates our questionings, our doubts, our fights, our arguments, and all of that. It's presupposed in the very argument itself. From this perspective, God is not some object. God precedes the subject-object binary. There's a subject, me, and I ask a question about an object, God. God is the ground out of which subject and object arise. God is the power of being. But because of this, God is not something that you can, as I say, argue for and against. God is presupposed in the very argument itself. Right, so that's what he means by the ontological approach to God. Think about it like this: science is motivated by truth, and you could say it's motivated by truth in two ways. One is it's trying to grasp the truth; it's moving towards the truth, but it's always a forever receding horizon. Science and scientific method never gives you the truth; it just gives you accuracy, it gives you descriptions, it gives you useful techniques, it gives you things. I mean, a scientific method is incredible, right? But truth is always forever receding. You never get the truth. What you end up with is a theory, the theory of relativity, gravity, evolution. None of these are the truth. These are the results of pursuing the truth. Pursuing a truth that you never get. The carrot that is always eschatological, always ahead of you. But also, for someone like Paul Tillich, the truth in science is also the stick, not just the carrot. It's what gets the scientist out of bed, questioning, asking, exploring the world, doing their thing, putting hypotheses out there and testing them. So the truth is not simply the forever receding horizon. It's the carrot that you never get. It's also the stick that hits you and gets you moving and gets you, moving forward. But the scientist never gets the truth. They kind of, in a sense, the truth is not something you get. The truth, in this sense, is this motivating force, this nothing, this no thing that gets results, but the results are never the truth itself. And so for Tillich, that's kind of like God, in a sense. God is what is presupposed, what gets us arguing about meaning and reality and what does it mean to be human and all of that. God is what's presupposed in that very discussion and that very argument. So you can't have doubts about God or certainty about God. God is not at the realm of epistemology. God is not at the realm of knowledge. God is that which presupposes all of our debates and our discussions. And to say that you love God is then to say, what do I love when I love my God? Because, every word or every phrase you put on that term kind of misses it. So that's the ontological approach, which he thinks you see in Augustine. And then there's the cosmological approach. And the cosmological approach is to treat God as an object that you can argue for and against, right? And he thinks that Aquinas kind of goes in this direction. So we can actually argue that God exists or that God doesn't exist. We can look at the evidence in the cosmos, in the world, and we can make suppositions. Now, Tillich, first of all, Tillich isn't against this completely. So that's key to, whenever you're reading this, you could think that Tillich's opposing these two and saying one's good and one's bad, but he's not quite saying that. But what he's saying is this approach to God as something you can argue for is the birth of atheism. So ironically, the defense of God intellectually is the beginning of atheism. Because the moment that you can say God is probable or God is evidenced in creation or anything like that, you can also argue that God isn't, or that, maybe 60% possibility, but 40% there's another explanation. So ironically, William Lane Craig, the people like that, for Tillich, are the people who open up the opposition to William Lane Craig. They are the opening of atheism. And Tillich then goes on to say, and in those debates, the atheists are right. So it's not just that the cosmological argument opens up atheism. It's that it opens up atheism, and atheism is the proper theological response to that understanding of God. And that's important kind of to understand the steps. He's not saying, oh, they gave birth to atheism and atheism is bad. They're like, no, they gave birth to atheism, which is the correct response to this very notion of God that's problematic. And of course, he doesn't say it's not bad motives. But as soon as you start treating God as an object that you can know, that you can kind of conceptualize intellectually, he says all manner of problems arise. I mean, very simply, Kierkegaard is very good on this. He would say that, well, no matter how much evidence you have, there's never enough evidence to give your whole life to something, right? Are you going to give yourself absolutely and unconditionally to something that you only have good evidence for? Would you not always retain a little bit of distance, waiting for the next philosophy journal to come out, the next, biology journal or whatever, just to see if your view is still epistemologically sound, right? So that's one potential problem. The second one that Tillich mentions is that you also start to get the rise of authority figures. Because let's just say that you can argue that God exists, and you can argue well and the arguments are solid. It gets a lot harder when you start arguing for things like the crucifixion or the resurrection or the incarnation, right? These are we don't have all the evidence available, right? Someone like William Lane Craig does try to argue with reason that like the resurrection happened. But even he'll admit that, these are probabilities we're talking about. And then what Tillich says is, well, then we need to rely on authorities, the authorities that kind of know the truth and kind of like protect it, so that we can't know the truth ourselves completely, but we have these institutions that are holders of the revelation. All of these things arise. But he also, let me think, what else would he say about that? Oh yes, he also thinks that this is where the misunderstanding of faith arises from. Because he says, with this view, faith becomes the equivalent of reading glasses, right? You have reading glasses because your eyesight isn't good enough on its own. So you put the glasses on and then whatever. Faith is that which helps us believe in something that we lack full evidence for. And this is actually the common understanding of faith today, which Tillich wants to wholeheartedly reject, and so do I. But where faith is, we don't have enough evidence to know if the next door neighbor stole, if our sister or brother stole the cheese out of the fridge. We don't have enough evidence to know that. But, we have faith that they didn't, right? We have faith that the cheese is going to still be in the fridge. We don't know for sure. It could have been stolen. We don't have full knowledge until we open up the fridge. But we have faith that our brother or sister would not have stolen our cheese. This is a terrible example, but it kind of works actually. Because in a sense, what happens is faith is saying we haven't opened up the fridge door yet. In other words, we haven't got to heaven, or we don't have full knowledge. So faith allows us to, to have commitment. But when we get to heaven, when we open the fridge door and we see face to face, then we won't need faith anymore. Faith is only required because of our inherent limitations. And Tillich says this notion of faith, moves away from the kind of the deep meaning of faith that we find in the biblical text. Okay, so there's the ontological and the cosmological. So just to clarify again, the ontological is the idea that God is not an object that you argue for. God is, in a sense, that which is presupposed in arguments themselves. Because as soon as two people argue about something, they're assuming truth. They're assuming that they can get to something. They're assuming that there is something worth arguing about. And it's those assumptions that, Tillich is saying, that's what we mean when we talk about God. God is the light that allows us to see, but we do not see the light, because the light is what enables us to see. Immanuel Kant would call these the transcendentals. They're the things that you cannot think, but they are required in order for you to think. Right? That's the ontological. The cosmological is God is an object that you can argue for. And by arguing for God, you can also argue against God, hence the birth of atheism. And actually, Tillich says atheism is the proper theological response to that notion of God. So we should side with the atheists, theologically speaking. Okay, now I just want to mention a little bit about his notion of faith, because I've said that from the cosmological perspective, faith becomes a prop for our lack of knowledge, right? Faith is what we need because we don't have full access to the truth. But from an ontological perspective, faith is something different. Faith for Paul Tillich is ultimate concern. It's giving ourselves wholly to a cause, to a person, to rituals, to a religion. Faith it's not about being kind of like a calculating and going, you know what, I'm going to give myself to this cause because I think I'm going to get something out of it. Faith is that weird, very human thing where you give yourself to something beyond rational calculation, beyond empirical evidence. It's whenever someone says, I know the world looks evil and horrible and that my entire experience of the world is terrible, but I believe in good, right? Whenever that belief contradicts everything empirically in that person's life, but they still give themselves to it, that's a type of faith. It was at Anne Frank. Slavoj Žižek uses this example where Anne Frank talks about the goodness of humanity in her diaries at the very point when everything empirically is pointing against that, right? That, in a sense, is a type of faith, a type of true belief, a belief that strangely stands against empirical reality, right? It's the giving of oneself wholly to the world. Now, Paul Tillich says that there are two types of faith, not in this essay, in a different book, but there's a diabolical type of faith, and there's a kind of divine, a good type of faith. So the diabolical faith is where someone gives themselves unconditionally and absolutely to something finite and conditioned. So you give yourself to patriotism, right? But where you say, my country, right or wrong, good or bad, I will live and I will die for it, right? So a form of fascism where you say, like, I live and I die for my country, for my flag. Now, that's faith for Tillich, because this person is willing to die for something beyond themselves. They're willing to give themselves ultimately to something. But, says Tillich, they are giving themselves ultimately, absolutely, to something that is not ultimate and something that is not absolute. They're giving themselves over to something that is finite, to a finite reality. But the opposite for Paul Tillich isn't some ethereal thing. right? That's important. For Tillich, there's a form of patriotism that would be healthy and good, that would exhibit true faith. And that would be a type of patriotism in which someone says, I love my country so much that I will live and die for it. And I believe that my country stands for democracy and freedom and liberation and justice. And so when my government, when the police or when the military or when the judicial system or the educational system stands against those principles, I will fight them and I will give my life in order to see those principles established. Now, for Tillich, that is a true faith because you're giving yourself absolutely to something in the world, something material, so your country, but you are driven by the transcendental elements of that: freedom, democracy, justice, liberation. Because all of these things you can't pin down. They are like truth. They're the forever receding horizon that you work towards but never achieve. As soon as someone says, we have democracy, there it is, we have it. It's not. It's always going to be less than democracy, because democracy, in the words of the philosopher Derrida, in a sense, is it's always still to come. It's got a messianic quality. It's the forever receding horizon that we move towards, and it's the stick that gets us moving. So the important thing here, and Tillich says it in this essay, he says theology is a guardian. At its best, one of its roles is to be a guardian, to guard against human beings giving ultimate concern to that which is not ultimate, right? That's one of the rules of theology, and he thinks that happens in the material world, in the religion, in the scientific world, as much as in the religious world. So one of his potential critiques of some of last week's thinkers, or what came out of those thinkers, is he says, if you have a purely a crude materialist view of the world, where there is nothing but materiality, you will tend towards giving yourself to ideologies that ultimately are destructive to the flourishing of humanity, the flourishing of life, right? You will give yourself over to ideologies that are not ultimate, and you'll treat them as if they're ultimate. The universe is closed off, and you give yourself to something that is closed off, and you lose the transcendental, you lose the unconditional, you lose the ontological. And so Tillich says one of the rules of theology is to keep that space open, which means for him, the reason why this is important is because, as I said, I said at the beginning, he's not saying the ontological view of God is good and the cosmological is bad. He's saying that the cosmological has to be built on top of the ontological, right? The ontological is the basis, and the cosmological is kind of like the everyday. And what he means by that is the cosmological is the realm of concrete religions, concrete ideas, concrete traditions, right? The cosmological is where we start to have symbols, where we start to make commitments, where we start to try to work out what does it mean to be faithful to this openness, to this truth that we can never grasp. And that's vital for Tillich. It just can't be the foundation. It's vital. So what he says is, as human beings, we give ourselves over to religions and to causes and to people, right? That's ultimate concern. We give ourselves. So in love, for example, you give yourself over to someone unconditionally, like more, like beyond your own calculating ego. You say, I love you, I care about you, I will live and I will die for you. And I guess what Tillich would say is, he would say that if you have a child, for example, and you unconditionally love that child, right? That's faith. You know, beyond their empirical, what they've done right or wrong, you love that child, that's faith. But he would say kind of like a bad faith would be if you say, well, my kid never does anything wrong, right? My kid, if the teacher ever says my kid did anything wrong, oh, my kid burnt down the school. No, my child was smoking and the cigarette fell on the ground and set the school on fire. No, my kid, first of all, doesn't smoke. Second of all, said that he wasn't even in the classroom, and thirdly said that when he was in the classroom he'd already put the cigarette out. Right? You find any form of rationality to kind of like justify that little Johnny would never do anything wrong. That would be kind of like a problematic. And there, of course, there are parents who do that, and we do that in love. Sometimes we think that the person we love can do no wrong. But the form of faith that Tillich talks about, he says, is where you actually go, okay, little Johnny does do wrong stuff, but I know that little Johnny has the potential to grow and mature and become better and more wonderful. And so part of your love for your child is also the love for the transcendental, the love for the future possibilities, for the potentialities, for that which isn't yet there in your child, right? So that's what this is, right? So Tillich says, one, theology keeps us open to that transcendental eschatological element of love, whether it's in causes, in individual love, or in religion. And then secondly, he says something very interesting where he says, and also we have to remember that faith is always a risk, that there is no faith without risk. And what he means by that is he says, when you commit to a person or a cause or a religion, there's always a chance that it doesn't draw you into the transcendental. It doesn't draw you into the power of being, to the flourishing of life. There's always a chance that you end up being on the wrong side. And we never think that. We never think we're the baddies, right? There's always a chance that our worldview, our way of seeing the world that we think is beautiful and loving and kind might turn out to not be at all, and might turn out to be destructive and against the power of being and against the flourishing of life. And there is no way to protect yourself from that. And that's amazing. So Tillich says you have to give yourself. So think about like a relationship. You make a commitment to someone, you go into it wholeheartedly, but there's always a risk. And there's I'll tell you the truth, we all know it. There's always the risk that it will kill you. It's always the risk that it will be utterly destructive. And there's always the possibility that it will be wonderful. And generally it's a mix of the two. But there's nothing that can protect you. You make the best decision you can. You throw yourself into it unconditionally, wholeheartedly, and you realize that there is an inherent risk to it. And so theology, interestingly, again, is that which reminds us of the risk. It keeps us open to the transcendental, and it always reminds us that our attempts at giving ourselves to concrete causes, concrete material goods, can sometimes result in pain and death, and we have to, in a sense, be able to acknowledge that and be open to admitting that and changing our ways if it does. Now, all of this is to say, if you're listening, to this, and you'll be hearing that it's very much about faith being a form of commitment to the world, and a commitment to the possibilities that are in the world. And that as you give yourself over to the world and to people and to causes, there's always a risk, there's always a danger, but you try to keep open to this eschatological dimension, this dimension that of justice, liberation, freedom, goodness, that you never finally get. Just like the scientist never gets truth, but what they end up with is useful theories that, are elegant, that are precise, that produce results. So the thinker who is pursuing truth, pursuing the transcendental, pursuing justice and liberation and freedom, the hope is what they end up with. They never end up with those things, but they hopefully end up with forms of life that are more beautiful, that keep open our longing for the future, that create worlds that are more beneficial to more people, etc., etc. And and so for Tillich, that is material theology. That's why theology is never directed to something outside the world, some object called God that we kind of like go into our closet to pray to, that we kind of remove ourselves from the world to encounter. God is not an object that we love. God is the name we give to the reality we encounter in the act of love itself, in the giving ourselves to the world. Now, when you read Dietrich Bonhoeffer this week, and there's some amazing stuff there. I would love to do a whole talk on him. Maybe I will. Maybe this week I'll record a little special talk. I can't promise that. But when you read him, again, he is saying that religionless Christianity, which is what he calls this, is a Christianity that lives as though God is not given, which means lives as though God is not some object that you can grasp, because to give something is to give something that you can touch or taste or see, but rather to give yourself fully to the world. He says when you do that, you live fully before God and with God. And that's what religionless Christianity is. He says, when you stand with the world, when you stand with the suffering, when you give yourself to the world, that is when you're affirming the truth of Christianity. That is when you encounter the transcendental, not in some abstract thought experiment, and not in some inner religious experience, not in some moving out of the world, but in the world itself. And this, by the way, and then with this, I'll finish up, look at the questions, but this is why I think Mother Teresa is such an important figure for materialist theology. In fact, for me, she's the patron saint of radical theology in many ways, definitely of parotheology. It's because for Mother Teresa, where she encountered God was resolutely not in religious experience, not in removing herself from the world, but rather was in her material commitment to the world, to a cause which was, to refusing to acknowledge the caste system, acknowledging everyone as infinitely valuable, which, by the way, is a type of belief, faith that transcends empiricism, because you can't empirically prove that everybody is invaluable. That's a type of faith. That's an unconditional commitment to people, to world, to infants in Calcutta. Now, this is most beautifully described, and this is why, by the way, I put in some of her some segments from her diaries. I read them out. It's actually a reading from like 10 years ago I did, so I was going to re-record it. But the reason is because you'll experience how she had this inner doubt and this inner sense of the loss of God. And actually, she wanted her diaries burned. But whenever she kind of, she realized that after she died, people would read her diaries, and she wanted them destroyed. And the first thing people thought was, okay, maybe there's some crazy secret. She's having an affair with the Pope or something, So it's something she doesn't want us to discover that's in her diaries. But no, there's nothing like that. So then people thought, oh, the secret was that she had doubts, that she experienced the loss of God. Because basically from the age of her early 30s right to the end of her life, she says she experienced basically nothing of God in her religious experience, or like vague moments. But actually, no, the reason why she wanted her diaries burned, one of the main reasons she wanted her diaries burned, was not because she was having an affair with the Pope, was not because she didn't want people to know that she didn't experience God in some inner life, but rather because she felt that people would mistakenly think that the inner life is where God is. That people would be obsessed with her inner life, with what it was like to be her. When she said, no, if you want to know the truth of God, look at the infants that are helped. Look at the child who is given life. Look at the orphanages that have been built. She was like, no, the truth is not in your inner experience. If you want a cool inner experience, just take drugs. She's going like, no, that's not the truth. There's nothing good or bad about that. It's like, God is in the material world, as you give yourself absolutely to that world, you find that God is there wonderfully disguised. And actually, there's a song by Mike Scott from the Waterboys called "Wonderful Disguise" that I should post up. And it's a song that is inspired by Mother Teresa, who on a number of occasions, but in one of the last interviews she ever gave, I think it was to Time magazine, she said that when she holds a child, that child is a wonderful disguise of the divine. Now, what she's not meaning is like that, that she's stripped back the child and there's God, but rather she holds the child and then momentarily she blinks, and for a brief moment she feels like she's holding Christ. And then she blinks again and she's holding the child. That in this material engagement with the world, she encounters the divine. So that essay, and it's not an easy essay, that's why I've given 3 days for it, but that essay, in a nutshell, argues that perspective. And it's influenced by the mystics, but it's also very much influenced by a reading of people like Feuerbach and Marx and Hegel, and an attempt to respond theologically to that. And so, if in a sense you could say that there's a spirituality that says the transcendent is high above, the transcendent in this existential theology is the ground, is down below. You don't ascend, you can never get to it. It's that out of which the world arises. And as you give yourself to the world, and as you make sure that the world is open to transcendental possibilities, you are affirming the scandalous message of Christianity, something that Dietrich Bonhoeffer called religionless Christianity, and that he articulated in the last days of his life before he was murdered by the Nazis. All right, let's have a little look at some questions. Okay, there's a very practical one for a start. David just says, will the site stay up indefinitely so we can go back to it afterwards? Yes. There's one slight problem. I did that for last year and it's up indefinitely, but I changed my website settings. I changed from a .net to a .com and everyone lost everything. And I'm giving it all back. So, some problem might arise a year, 2 years, 5 years down the line. So if I were you, I would download everything. But technically, no, I'm not going to take it away or anything like that. And I'll try and make sure it stays up. James saying, you mentioned your concept of faith is different from the ones you described. So what's your understanding of faith? Well, my understanding of faith is similar to Tillich's. I was saying that I agreed with Tillich that the notion of faith as that which supplements knowledge, that which supplements reason, is problematic. I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of faith. Now, my understanding is not exactly the same as Tillich's. It's built on Tillich's. My understanding of faith, broadly speaking, is unconditional commitment to the absurd, to the inherent unknowability of the universe, and a commitment to living within that. But that's very close to Tillich. So, for the sake of this essay, or this talk, I'll go. I'm pretty close to Tillich. Neil, I think only half your questions here, but you said, has there ever been a critical comparison of Tillich's true faith and bad faith with that of, and then you got cut off, but critical comparison of Tillich's true faith and bad faith? I'm not sure, but because I don't see the second part of your question, I can't answer it, but there is a book that Tillich wrote called The Dynamics of Faith, and it's brilliant. So if you're interested in that kind of like what Tillich's understanding of faith, get The Dynamics of Faith. It's a small book. It's like 3 or 4 chapters, and it's very, very good. So Kevin says, so when do our symbols become words of definition trying to define God, making him object? Yeah, Kevin, so great question. Like for Tillich, The problem is when we make something that is not absolute into the absolute. So when you take a symbol and you make it into something literal. So for Tillich, literalism, you know what people say, oh, something's just symbolic. Tillich goes, no, 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 you get it wrong. Things are just literal. Symbolism is always more than literalism. It's not less than literalism. So a flag is literally cloth and colors, right? That's literally what it is, right? But it symbolizes a country, or it symbolizes values, or it symbolizes an oath, right? So Tillich would go like, well, it's just literal if you take the cloth and the material and the wood of the pole. But if you understand that the literal stuff then allows this to be symbolic, then that's what's interesting. But when you take the symbolism and reduce it to literalism, that's when Tillich says you're in basically diabolical faith. I don't know if he calls it diabolical faith, but I think he uses the term demonic faith. And so any symbol can become idolatrous. Any symbol can become problematic. It's instead of the window through which you see, it becomes the thing that you focus on, and then it's a problem. That's Jean-Luc Marion, a great philosopher, talks about the difference between idols and icons. An idol is an object that you think captures the essence of the absolute. An icon is a visible thing that draws you into the invisible. So the face of someone you love is like an icon. It's visible, but it draws you into, their emotions and their inner life that you cannot see. The face becomes this icon that draws you beyond what's visible. And so Tillich's in a sense saying that, yeah, one person's icon can become another person's idol. He's also saying, by the way, that some symbols are better than others, and that's the risk of faith. You give yourself over to certain ways of thinking, to certain traditions, but those traditions might be problematic, and that's the risk that we inherently take. And Stephen's saying, oh yeah, do talk on Bonhoeffer. Oh yeah. He says, can you give a concrete example of building the cosmological on top of the ontological? Absolutely. So first of all, that would be like saying God, that's like saying God is father or God is mother, right? If that's based on top of the ontological argument or the ontological approach, these are symbols, these are icons, these are ways of kind of like putting our thoughts into concrete terms, but they don't capture, they don't nail things down. But if you think that they do nail it down, that's where the problem is. So the cosmological is whenever you take something like God as a mother or God as a father, and you go, okay, yeah, there are fragile, fractured terms. There are wounded words that we use to try to approach and open ourselves up to the transcendental. That would be the cosmological on top of the ontological. But when you take them literally, that would be where the problems arise. And he says, and thirdly, do you think that often theological writing gets this backwards? First building on the cosmological argument, then trying to offer room for the ontological. Yeah, and that's kind of, if I get you right, yeah, that's kind of what I think Tillich's saying with Aquinas. And Aquinas doesn't quite, fit with this model, I think, but he's saying that if we start with the cosmological, we're going to go wrong, and then, you start, but someone like Pseudo-Dionysius is probably saying the opposite. He says, no, you start with literalism, just like a kid. You start with understanding the world in a very literalistic way, and then you get to a more complex understanding. So perhaps a way of saying it would be in terms of our own personal history, we start with the cosmological and we move to the ontological. But in terms of logic, we start with the ontological and get to the cosmological. So you see the difference is like, as an individual, historically, I start with the cosmological, I start with literalism, and then often move to this other step. But in terms of actually how it works in reality, it's the other way around. Oh yeah, David's asking, what is process theology and where does it fit into this discussion? How does it differ from parotheology? Oh, that's a big question. Funnily enough, Paul Tillich mentions in this essay Whitehead, and Whitehead is the philosopher who developed process philosophy, which also branched into process theology. And Paul Tillich says that process is one of the contemporary theological forms that he thinks is ontological in basis. So he basically is saying that he likes it, you know. So I don't feel like I know enough of Whitehead to kind of talk about that, but yes, but Whitehead definitely is more in this ontological category than this cosmological category. It's all just more too metaphysical for me. So if I won't answer that question in depth because I don't think it might interest very many of you. But I love Tillich and I read Tillich and I'm interested in process theology. I read a little bit of it, but it's all too metaphysical. It's all making very big claims to the ground of reality and the nature of the universe. And I'm much more. I'm not so drawn to that kind of thinking. Not that maybe that'll come out next week. Maybe my thinking will come out more next week. Luna, if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, you're saying on the cosmological side, how can one objectify God without going too far? Are there any boundaries or formulas to follow to stay within proper limits? And what are these limits? Oh yeah, very good. So yeah, when does a symbol become literal? When does patriotism, which says, I love my country because I believe it stands for democracy and justice, become, I love my country regardless of whether it stands for democracy and justice? I mean, in reality, it's probably incredibly difficult. That's what Tillich means by the risk of faith. Is like the move from iconography to idolatry is very subtle. We see it in other people, but we don't see it in ourselves. There's probably, I mean, what would Tillich say? He thinks that partly religious rituals at their best are rituals that sensitize us to the transcendental. They sensitize us to that which we cannot speak. Now, my own view on this, by the way, is why I developed decentering practices. Where you try to decenter yourself by listening to the voices of whoever you consider other, and like really listening and trying to kind of be decentered by them. And the reason why I think this is important is that very act often exposes within us where our own absolutes, where we've made a non-absolute absolute, where we've made a conditional unconditional, is whenever we encounter someone who's very different than us and we find ourselves hating them, shouting them down, using nasty words to describe them. Sometimes that can be accurate, but often we're very quick to do that and slow to listen. So yeah, if I wanted to answer your question in more depth, I think there are practices that are useful. I mean, take psychoanalysis as an example. I think psychoanalysis is a good example of a practice designed to help you look at what you've made into absolutes through talking and self-questioning and self-critique, and also atheism for Lent. Actually, there you go. Atheism for Lent is one of the decentering practices I kind of developed, and it's in a sense a practice designed to try to draw out where in our lives we have created idolatries. But there's no way of protecting ourselves absolutely, and that's important to probably acknowledge. But we don't have to be resigned about it. There are definitely techniques like atheism for Lent, like the Last Supper, another decentering practice that I do sometimes. That these are designed to try to keep open what Tillich says, like where theology is a guardian that keeps open the transcendental. These are practices that try to keep open that space. and not shut it down? But yeah, good question. um, oh yeah. Let's see. A couple of questions I'm passing by just because I don't think I have anything very profound to say about them. Yeah, like Jared said, we live, I've heard we live in a post-truth culture. How do you respond to that idea? I feel like I would waffle at this point, but I do think it's connected. And I would love you to make the connections. Like, what are you hearing in Tillich's article that's contemporary to today? I hear lots of things. When I read it this evening, I thought, well, this is just as contemporary today as it was when it was written in probably the 1960s. Joan asks, what would Tillich's view of God and faith have to say about morality in terms of arguing what is right and wrong, what is sin, which is often a major component of religion? Yes. Well, yeah, Joan, that opens up really interesting questions. Tillich would not have a moral notion of sin, and neither do I. And by that, he would think, I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth here, but in a nutshell, sin for him probably describes a lack, a kind of a lack that's part of being human. Sin means separation and lack, and that so sinful activity is anything we try to do to fill that lack, to try to make ourselves, whole, complete, etc., etc. Now I'm getting into my work. Actually, this is where I blur the line between Paul Tillich and myself. But the whole point of this is, for someone like Tillich or myself, morality, theologically speaking, is sin is talking about a very particular form of human suffering, which is where we try, like in the Garden of Eden, where Adam and Eve think if they eat the piece of fruit, they'll be like God, which means whole and complete. And the serpent is like, if you eat that piece of fruit, you'll be like God. The idea for me is, again, theologically speaking, human beings have this drive to be whole and complete, to be kind of happy and all of that. And that drives us to do all manner of destructive things in our lives, and hurt other people and hurt ourselves and pursue things which are damaging. And actually, grace is the freedom from that drive, where you're okay, you're not okay, I'm not okay, and that's okay, right? That's grace is the freedom from the pursuit, the tyranny of wholeness and completeness. So Tillich's whole view of morality is very different. It's existential. It's not. Yes, he wouldn't say that theology tells us, what is right or wrong in a particular thing. He would say that what theology does is it helps us be open to the flourishing of life, and that we always have to take a risk in deciding what that flourishing looks like. And there's no way of never ever knowing exactly what we should do. But theology sensitizes us to the ground of being. It sensitizes us to one another. This is where I got the idea. I don't know if it's Tillich, so I don't want to say it's Tillich's, but I think of church as having two main functions at the moment. One is to sensitize us to the call of the other, to the voice of the other, to the other who says, "Do not murder me," whose face says. So Tillich says this, and so does Emmanuel Levinas, that the other always says, "Do not murder me, do not objectify me, do not abuse me." So the church should sensitize us to that call, and also the church should help us take responsibility for what we do in response to that call. Not tell us what to do, not give us the answer, but rather remind us that we have to answer that call and that we don't know exactly what we should do. And that's kind of like the moral position for Tillich, I would say, is that, he says that in My Search for Absolutes, another very good book of Tillich's, where he says, we do not know what to do, but we know we have to do something. And that is the absolute. That is responding when we don't know what to do, is what it means to be moral, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense. I'll do one or two more. Oh yeah, JD says, looking forward to Easter being the end of Lent. Yes. How do we celebrate the resurrection with uncertainty about what it means? Well, the great thing is this Lent finishes with, basically we're going to end up with Christ on the cross saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And if nothing else, I really hope that that takes on a deeper meaning in the light of these 40 days. That in some respects, those words have a depth to them that they may not have had before, because you've maybe experienced this kind of crazy kind of forsakenness yourself, that you stand in the very sight with Christ in that cry. Um, but yeah, in terms of resurrection, here's what I would say about that, or what I think Bonhoeffer would say about that. I think he would say that to stand in the resurrection is God in the midst of life. So you have like pre-crucifixion, you have this idea of God as a being up in the sky. Post resurrection, you have this idea of God as where two or three are gathered together in love, where two or three are gathered together looking out for one another, where the community shares alike. So in light of this week's readings, think about the resurrection as the the opening up of the epoch of the Holy Ghost, which is the idea of God being in the community of believers who give themselves over to the world. So that for Tillich and for Bonhoeffer and others would be a way of affirming the resurrection in the light of everything you've read. Angel says, it seems more natural for you to understand how other thinkers see things and less for you to offer what you personally stand on. Why is that? Oh, so I'll start with that first half. It's only because this Atheism for Lent isn't about my position as such, although my position kind of leaks out a little bit, because obviously I've curated this, I've picked out thinkers that I think are important, but there is a difference between, you know, drawing people into great thinkers and also then putting your own perspective. And I think good lecturers, you shouldn't really know what they think whenever they're teaching a course. However, when I'm actually teaching on parotheology, then, I'm much more, clear on the direction I'm taking. But atheism for Lent for me isn't about, me arguing for my position, but more about how do we listen to, and how do I uh, help us be sensitive to the voices of these various thinkers. So yeah, it's really context. But if you do one of my other courses, I'll probably talk a lot more about what I think. But in this course, it's important for me to draw out these thinkers. But by the way, they're both equally important. I don't think one's more important than the other. In fact, if I had to say which was more important, it would be, um, I would want to be a person who is able to, as I say, be a John the Baptist to other thinkers. But then, of course, in fear and trembling, occasionally I'll tell you what I think. But then the second half, how do you decide what you believe today for yourself, or what to shelve? Do you lean on heart, soul, mind, experience, concurrence with others, etc.? Yeah, well, yeah, that's a big question. But I suppose my positions are drawn from thinking and reading all the people that you're reading at the moment and all these others, and you eventually over time come to a position. But my position is broadly similar to Hegel, and Hegel thinks that all great thinkers have something amazing to say, that it's not about agreeing and disagreeing with thinkers. Often it's about looking at yourself through their eyes and seeing what they reveal to you. So one thing philosophy's taught me is that I tend not to read articles to agree or disagree with them. I tend to read things in order to see what worlds they open up, what they get me to think about, which makes it weird because sometimes it can get you in trouble. But like, as I say, I tend to, if I read a great thinker, instead of like trying to come to like, do I agree or disagree with them, I go like, what worlds do these thinkers open up for me? But of course, I do have positions of my own. Um, Questions posed on behalf of Daniel. Let's see. Questions are in order of importance. Don't want to monopolize the conversation. Don't worry. So if you can't get to all of them, fair enough. But I'd like to hear your thoughts. So 1, some people live truly miserable, painful lives from start to finish. What does atheism have to say to them? Friendship, great. Hospice care, wonderful. Sympathy, I'll take it. But is there really no justice? Some people have terrible lives, tough break, etc. So so interestingly, I would kind of refer back to what I said last week, which is there's kind of 2 different types of hope. You can maybe have both of them. One is, the hope for a better life in the next world, and a hope that says you can have a better life in this world, and not everybody can. But there is this thing, I suppose, someone like Joe Hill would say, which is human beings also have the ability to have hope for future generations. So even if you can't have hope for yourself, it is possible that you can, fight for a better world for your children, or for a fantasized future that you're never going to be a part of. Now, that isn't very much, but, I guess you're asking, where's the consolation? And yes, there's definite consolation in saying to people, and it could be true or it might not be true, that in the next life, everything will be fine. And that let's take away the truth or falsity of that and just go, that can be a nice thing to hear at times. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think, from kind of a material position, there's also the possibility that someone can have a truly miserable life, but find meaning in still working towards a future that they won't participate in. In fact, I mean, it sounds crazy when you first say it, but I actually think the mystics are right in this, that when you can actually get beyond hope for yourself and expand your sense of hope beyond your ego, and by ego I don't mean like selfishness or whatever, just your ego as in me as Peter Rollins. If you're able to extend your hope beyond yourself to something greater, a cause, life in general, to other people, that actually that's a richer, you'll find yourself having a richer form of life, not a happier form of life. That's the thing, that none of this promises you a happier life. But someone like Bonhoeffer would probably say that is a deeper and richer form of life than where you put yourself in your hope for your own ego. And by the way, that is in atheist and theistic terms. So the theistic term will be you'll get to heaven and everything will be fine. But the atheistic form might be, well, you can have as much money as you want, have a great life, everything will be wonderful. And from this other perspective, you'd be saying that both of those are poverty stricken, because both of them are connected to your own ego. And so the better way of thinking is, can you expand your notion of hope and your notion of the good beyond your sense of self? And then there's a theistic version of that and an atheistic version of that. A theistic version of that would be, Schleiermacher's like, well, no, you don't exist after death, but you return to, you return to what you came from. You return to something greater, like the Buddhist notion, or an atheistic version would be, that you want a just society, and that you may not participate in that just society, but you work towards it, and you find real joy in imagining that after you're gone, that just society will arise. That's just one thought on that. But if there is no God, then why speak of God? Shouldn't we just speak about good works? If there is no God, see, that's not what this is about, Daniel. That's the cosmological idea. Like, that's like saying, why speak of Shakespeare? It's because Shakespeare is talked about. It's not like people talk about God. God is like this huge part of human society. It's like we're not talking about whether God exists or not. That was like we did that in week 1 to get over it. This is about that God is this word and this term that is used by millions. It means multiple different things, and it has this depth and richness. That's why people like Tillich and Bonhoeffer talk about God. It's not because they're trying to argue that God exists or not. They're trying to make sense of what is empirically true, which is like, why do we talk about God? Not why as in give an argument. It's already obvious that we do. So you don't have to give an argument for why people talk about God. It's obvious that they do. What one does is, talk about what that means, what that tells us about humanity, what that tells us about our world, what that tells us about ourselves. So again, that's an atheist response. The atheist response would be, you don't talk about God. There is no, but in theology, it's like the word God is it's like love. It's a word that exists and that has a history and has a tradition and tells us something deep about ourselves. And in a sense, we need to, in order to kind of get to the depth of the word, we kind of get beyond whether God exists or not, to something else, I think. And then atheism is a lack of belief in God or gods. How do you distinguish paratheology from atheism? Now, Daniel, I'm kind of going I'm guessing that's the point of atheism for Lent, but is to kind of show that atheism is not just that. So atheism is a regional word. So yeah, so you're right. Atheism is a lack of belief in God or gods, but God, atheism is always the rejection of a particular type of God. So mysticism has atheism involved. Existential theology has mysticism involved. New atheism is a form of atheism, but also is the kind of atheism of the 19th century. So atheism itself is this rich and complex term that has a theological and a philosophical sense. So this course is trying to kind of is trying to say atheism. So paratheology is a form of atheism, or it has atheism built into it. But it's that's kind of and maybe it'll become clearer next week, because next week we look at kind of some contemporary atheists who are theological, like people like Slavoj Žižek, and maybe that will become clearer. Let's see. Thank you, Maria. You're saying you're enjoying this. Thank you. I appreciate that. Jordan, would the Rabbi Jesus warn us of this practice? I don't know. I'm not sure. The funny thing is, but I do think that, regardless of whether, Jesus would like this, I think that from Tillich's perspective, Jesus was, in a sense, I'd say from the perspective of Tillich, was trying to open up the trying to make sure that the transcendental wasn't colonized by the finite. So which is basically idolatry. Idolatry is like one of the biggest themes in the Bible. So it's like, so someone like Tillich would see Jesus as attempting to have open people up to new perspectives and new possibilities, and not to reduce the transcendental, and also to bring people into an embrace of the world. But as to whether this does it, I don't want to say, but Tillich would definitely say that he sees Jesus as trying to kind of open up the finite, and also in service to the world. Let's see. Stephen says, could you make a compendium of all the materials in one PDF? I don't know. What material? You're talking about the other materials? Oh, you're talking about the 40 reflections or other stuff that I talk about? That would be one big PDF. But mind you, it's all up there. Oh, yes. Oh, I see. I asked 2 questions and I didn't wait to hear your response. But everything that's up there will remain up there. So, I'm not going to steal it away. If it does disappear, it's just because I've been technically incompetent and I've done something really stupid. But I can't do PDFs anyway, because some of them are lectures, some of them are talks, some of them are, some only well, I mean, most of them, to be honest, are able to be made into PDFs, but some of them wouldn't be. Because, that's like the readings of Mother Teresa, or the song, or all that kind of stuff. Guys, thank you so much. I hope that I answered at least some of your questions, and I'll have a look at a couple more. Zach says, have you used David Hume as a resource in Atheism for Lent in the past? I have, actually. Would you consider doing it in the future? Yeah, no, David Hume was one of the ones we used last year, and that was very interesting. I mean, basically, I just have to keep mixing it up. So David Hume is incredibly important for all of this. In terms of week one, I don't think he's, that he's in the early weeks, he'd be a good, but yeah, I mixed it up, so he didn't get any Hume this year, maybe next year. Let's see. All right. Listen, I really appreciate it. And by the way, Daniel, I hope I gave some justice to your questions. I hate saying, oh, next week that will answer that, because that's always like a kind of a get out. So I hope that kind of like, at least it made a little sense when I talked about how, for people who are in the continental philosophy tradition, the question is, why do we talk about God? What does that tell us about ourselves? What does that tell us about the world? And what does it tell us about our mind, et cetera, et cetera? And that part of the course is about trying to kind of like really enrich our understanding of atheism and how it's very connected to the theological tradition. And by the way, I forget that you haven't actually read this week's readings yet. This is me talking about existential theology, which is you're about to read. So actually, some of your questions might be answered as you read some of the stuff this week. Mary Daly will be an interesting one. Mary Daly's sermon. This is a famous sermon. She was the first woman to preach in this Harvard, a chapel, in like 130 years of its existence. And she used this opportunity to get up and call everybody to walk out together. And so that's a really interesting sermon. And Mary Daly was very influenced by Paul Tillich. And, you see this turn to the material world and to the issues of justice in Mary Daly. And she turned away from theology entirely. So again, she's this interesting person who mixes theology and atheism in a really potent kind of mix. So I think you'll enjoy that. And it's read by my friend Sochil, who was a student of Mary Daly's. So that makes it even more interesting. All right. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the readings, and I'll talk to you again next week. Bye-bye.